Good afternoon. Is this working? Okay, my lapel's working, great. I guess I would prefer not to compete with the back, at least for a little while. I know it's always challenging to get everybody back after lunch. It's a pleasure, an honor, privilege to be here. And when I was asked to come to Dublin, it was an easy yes, because every time I come here, the warmth and the hospitality in particular, somebody who needs to be called out is Michael, who has been like my buddy, and I now have learned is the uncle of one of the organizing leaders. So you know what? It speaks to a family influence. And Martin and the rest of the team, congratulations on this inaugural event, getting this off the ground, getting any initiative. Getting any initiative is not easy. Getting an initiative off at a field that is nascent is particularly challenging. And I think credit also to Aubrey, who helped through his brand, name recognition, wisdom, get people together and get everybody here. I'm going to sort of touch on some comments, many of which I made in Copenhagen, on challenges, opportunities, some thoughts on what it may need to get to the next level. And I think it's appropriate for me to mention a couple of comments. I'm the newcomer to this field. Probably about 3 years ago, I'd never thought about actually working in this field of neuroscience, healthy lifespan. Some of these terms I'd actually never heard. I was one of those physicians early in my career practicing on disease-focused areas like diabetes and endocrinology and all the rest of it. There's been tremendous progress, but the field is not new in some ways. Of course, the science in this area has been published for almost a century. And like any field, there is a long incubation period of gradual understanding of biology, or the fundamental science, if it's in the physical sciences. And then it starts to reach an inflection point. And what's exciting right now, looking around this room and other similar venues, the fact that we're holding this meeting tells you that a lot of different leaders in different ways are starting to recognize that this is an inflection point. And when that happens, a few things start to develop, one of which is resources flow. And the most important resources I'll talk about is not money, but talent. And it is minds. We almost always focus on, well, how am I going to get the budget? How am I going to get the investment? How am I going to get the research grant? But those are all enablers, right? They enable people to have the luxury to focus their mind on the problem they're trying to solve. And then there's always pioneers, some of which are in this room, who've really single-handedly in some cases, or collectively in small teams, led the field with the belief, before everybody else got on the bandwagon, people like me follow, where you say, I know there's something worth doing. And those also should be recognized, and several of them are in this room, have presented already some of their ideas. However, the science, if you look at it, is compelling. It is compelling when we look at data at the cellular level, at simple organisms like yeasts and worms. It's compelling at the rodent level. We're seeing some large animals. And today, I have absolutely been convinced that Marvel Comics was onto something with Batman. Only it was Batwoman that I was really impressed with today. What an amazing talk. So I don't know that, maybe there's some royalties due here. I don't know. But this is all true. But then the business leader, executive in me asks a different question, which is, with all this compelling evidence, why hasn't it translated into making a difference in people's lives? We have to ask that question, because if we're going to change something, and you'll hear me talk about invention versus innovation, Because what I'm sensing here and observing is there's a lot of inventing going on and there's almost no innovation. And so the question is, why have these inventions not been translated into innovations? And why do I call invention? Inventions are everything you've heard about today. But an invention only becomes an innovation, in my mind, when it makes a difference in the end consumer or user's life. And if it doesn't reach the end consumer, the only person benefiting is the people publishing papers and filing patents. And with all due respect, that only serves the interests of the scientists. And I used to be a scientist before I couldn't cut it anymore, so I decided to lead companies. But the fact is, we have a gap. And the gap is, and if we don't accept that gap, we're not going to try to think about what's the solution. And many of these solutions exist in rooms like this. And I'm going to touch on some thoughts in that area. I'll also talk, the last part of my talk, about Hevolution, our organization. But let me say something from the start. In any field, including this one, especially when it's nascent, if a field remains focused on individuals and personalities, it dies. If a field matures and transitions to being about the mission, the individual becomes irrelevant. I don't care who you are. And so we have to ask ourselves, how do we now transition from the superstar to the leadership that's needed to move this field forward? And if we do not cultivate leaders, and if we continue to cultivate stars, then we're going to have a problem. And this is true in every discipline, science, technical, or otherwise. And the essence of leading a field is not about the people in this room, but it's also going to be about how do we get everybody who's not in this room to join on this journey. Because this room is full of people who are already convinced. And we represent way too few. So let me first re-articulate. The economic argument has been made. I'm not going to dwell on that. Andrew Scott and others have published some amazing papers, some really brilliant thinking. The social and epidemiological impact is clear. If we're successful in compressing HealthSpan, expanding HealthSpan and compressing morbidity, the economic, social, and human return is almost immeasurable. We can't imagine numbers of the size and scale that we're talking about. I don't know what $1 trillion looks like, but it's a large number. And we're talking about tens of trillions of dollars. So the ministers of finance across the world should not see that as an argument. The question is, why don't they believe us? Because if the ROI is that high, and the return on invested capital is that high, and the papers demonstrate that, there's a gap between our leaders believing those numbers. So us restating them, or citing them, or referencing them at every meeting won't change anything. And by the way, I'm old enough in my life now that I don't need another job, so I can say things that you may not want to hear. But as my team knows, I go to work every day assuming I'm going to get fired. And it'll make my wife of 40 years of marriage very happy because she'll have me back. Well, at least that's what she tells me, but who knows reality? So the gap here, in part, is between the science and business investing in it and the policy framework. In fact, the science is so far ahead of the policy framework that the two aren't even meeting. And so one of the challenges I'd like to throw out at this audience is not just how do we fund research, because research really, in my mind, has several stages: discovery, development, deployment, and implementation. If you look at the distribution curve, where do you think this room has been about today? First stage. And so if we keep asking more funds here. And of course, we'll get the argument, but once we have things to deploy, we'll get onto it. That's sequential thinking. Has anybody got long enough in this world to think in that manner? If you really are believing in this, if you're a corporation, and I've led 2 large corporations in my career, you think a corporation thinks when a product is developed, then I'll think about how I'm going to distribute and market it? No. The distribution work and the deployment work and all of that starts in parallel with the product development because there is confidence that you're going to deploy it, right? And yet we're talking about a field where, well, when we're done with this, then we'll start deploying it. By the way, at which point this might be obsolete anyway. And then the circle continues. So how do we do that? Which means we're going to have minds in this room who have expertise beyond what's present today. And the question then we have to ask ourselves, how do we attract those people into this room? And this is where I love to teach when I teach the difference between a dream and a vision. A dream is seen by one person. A vision is the same dream shared by many. So what do leaders do? The leaders only have one job. And that is how to take their dream and make it a vision for everybody. The minute you do that, you've solved the problem. And if it's about you yourself, not only are you going to not make it a vision for everybody, it's not going to change because it's about yourself. The minute it becomes a vision, it becomes about the mission. So we have to ask ourselves, what are we going to do that? Now, why don't we have translational science? Well, one of the challenges, this is just an observation, while we have numerous studies conducted, all too often, very few of those have been reproduced and revalidated. Ask yourself. And there's 2 blocks to that. One is our funding mechanism inhibits follow-on revalidation reproduction studies. Why? Because you don't get the faculty recognition, you don't get the STARS publication, you're never going to make the top-tier journal by saying, I reproduced this study, or when I did it, I couldn't get the same results. But I can tell you as an investor, until it's been revalidated, reproduced, how do I know that this wasn't by chance? Oh, it was reproduced again and again in the same lab, but that's not good enough. Would you take a drug that only the discoverer had actually conducted studies on? No. We call that conflict of interest, not suggesting there is, but it's perception, and it needs to be addressed. So how do we fund and conduct studies to revalidate what's already been done? It's a critical missing step right now, not only in the private sector, but on the government and academic sector, and we need to think about this. Inventions are proof of principle. Inventions occur in technology, mostly in an academic environment. Innovations have 3 other characteristics. They are robust, they are scalable, and indeed they are translated into platforms using multiple discoveries that come together, which therefore requires collaboration and coordination. Collaboration and coordination. And ask ourselves, as a field, not as a lab, as an individual field, how much collaboration is actually happening, and across the field, how much coordination is happening? Or are we a series of individual contributors and individual organizations trying to demonstrate whose is better than the others? You understand the difference? Collaboration and coordination. And that only occurs when you're focused on the mission, and that is critical. So let me give you examples of some non-sexy innovations that didn't result in sexy publications, but changed the world. The internet, GPS, email, cell phones, I can go on and on. Was there a star publication around, we've just created the internet? We've just launched GPS. We have cell phones. You understand where I'm going? They change the world. And so if we're going to change the world for humans around aging healthy, it's going to take not an individual discovery, but a moonshot. And to solve complex problems that are major global moonshots requires funding, collaboration, and coordination. And therefore requires leadership and requires the desire to cross industries, sectors, geographies, politics, all of that. I can go on and on. It's going to require the development of tools. The tools to interrogate the biology, the tools to measure the impact, the tools to measure progress, the difference between biomarkers and targets. But if we don't open source the tools, then you, by definition, will have created barriers to progress. And before you think, but investors want this, they want economic return, we thought that about cell phone technology until the Indians launched phones at 1 cent a minute. They decided not to compete on the physical infrastructure, open sourced it, and competed on the service, and created massive wealth across the world. The internet did the same. Massive wealth of companies using the internet, open sourced the internet. Nobody patented its use. You understand where I'm going? If you really want to change the world around this, we have to ask ourselves, what are we willing to contribute to move the mission? And this is not about corporations. Corporations will come along, investors will come along, so long as we take the barriers away, all of them, where it will take. And that takes effective collaboration, but also effective policies. How do we incentivize this? What do we do? Let me give you a really provocative thought to think about. I have no idea how you'd do this. But imagine the pharmaceutical industry coming together in a legal way with the right oversight, saying we are no longer going to compete on drug safety. Everything in drug safety we're going to open source. So that every drug trial is not relearning what somebody else already learned. But we're going to compete only on efficacy. Not saying it's doable. I'm just giving you that as an example. Imagine how much safer and how much quicker drugs would come to market. But that takes policy, it takes frameworks, it takes collaboration, it takes the regulator, all of those things to come together. Can it happen? Yes. Will it happen? I don't know. Do we have the will? Do we have the leadership? So let me, in the last few minutes, talk about Hevolution. Hevolution Foundation was launched this year. I've heard everybody's individual perception of what it is. Everybody sees it from what they see it. So I started working on this project called Hevolution Foundation 3 years ago. Credit goes to people like Michael Ringel at BCG. It wasn't my brainchild. It was the brainchild of our board. The desire to launch something global that could have an impact across the world. I did help shape our vision statement. And that was important to me because the vision statement is very simple. We want to expand healthy lifespan for the benefit of all. 4 components. Healthy lifespan. It's not about living longer. It's not about longevity. It's about healthy lifespan. And for the benefit of all, we want to be not only inclusive, but personally at this point in my career, or actually most of I have no desire to work on something that's going to touch 100 people or 500 people or a few zillionaires, or invest in technologies that are going to touch the lives of a handful of people. I have no desire to do that. And so to me, everything we do, we ask ourselves the question, is this going to have scale? Or can it be scaled? And if so, what will it take? Whether that scale requires capital, efficiency of operations, distribution, whatever. Is there line of sight to what it can do to scale? It has to have maximal impact. For lots of reasons, But most importantly, we cannot live in a world where the haves get even more and the have-nots don't get a part of that. If healthy lifespan can be expanded, imagine the populations that are suffering the most from morbidities having even less to share of that opportunity. That is not a society that any of us wants to live in. So that's very key. Now, how are we going to do it? We have two key verticals. We are established as a nonprofit organization. That was very important to me personally, because if once we're established as a nonprofit, everything we do is about moving the field forward, not about the financial or other return. This is not about an individual, it's not about money. It is about moving this field forward. But I recognize from my 40-year career that to move the field forward requires us to move the science forward, attract new talent, attract talent from adjacent fields, and to bring that to market requires capital which is willing to take risk where traditional sources of capital will not take the risk. And by doing that, we can move that into the translation phase. Take that in mind, we have two verticals. Number one, we fund research in the academic or in the private sector, depending on the opportunity. And it's very easy for me to say this. We have no strings attached to that funding as a foundation. We don't want IP, we don't want royalties. It comes with zero strings attached. I'm very firmly committed to that, because the minute I go from being a foundation to expecting financial return from that grant changes my perspective of what I may or may not be willing to do. I don't want to address that issue. It's easy. Here's a grant. If your results are successful, come back and tell us. The only expectation is, of course, you publish it. We don't even tell you whether you should patent it or not. The important is the quality of the science. The second is we want a portfolio of grants, both from established investigators, but also a problem that has clearly been identified by many in science, is the average age of funded scientists by the NIH and NSF and others has only been increasing the last 20 years, to the point where it's now reached somewhere close to 60. I have nothing against 60. I happen to be in my mid-60s. But at some point, some of us old curmudgeons have got to retire. And we've got to attract new blood, not just as postdocs, but develop them, train them, fund them, so that they become established investigators as we once were. And so we've got to take a risk on these new ideas, even if they don't have the track record. Unfortunately, if you require a certain track record to give you funding, then of course, guess who's going to get funded? We need to change that. So we aim to do that, and we've already launched our first series of grants addressing that gap in the funding. The second is our investment arm. Our investment arm is like any other venture capital, with one major difference. Our venture capital is to fund from launch seed stage all the way through to pre-IPO. We will not invest in bridge rounds or taking you to public. There's lots of capital available to that if you get to that far. However, 2 points. Number one, 100% of the financial returns of our venture capital go back into the foundation. 100%. We will take no financial returns from a venture capital. We do expect returns, but we want to put it back in. And we do not expect financial returns from the research funding. We do expect it from the venture capital, just like any other, to push the rigor and the quality of what we invest in, but the profits go back into the foundation to operationalize and further continue. The second, because of that, we are willing to invest in areas where most venture capital funds will not invest, including investing in technologies that might be off patent, technologies that might be generic drugs, technologies that could repurpose drugs. Willing to consider it, absolutely. It's within our domain. Why? There may be 1,000+ molecules out there that could actually change the biology, but nobody's willing to go after them. Half the time, the scientists know which one it is, but can't find an investor. We could change that. We're willing to do that, and the team's actually looking at that right now. The third, because if you do any finance courses, you learn the return on invested capital has an important variable called time. If it takes longer to return, your ROIC goes down. It's not that complex. However, if you're not looking as the net mission is not financial return, then you will fund something that's going to take longer to return. Changes the equation. The third, very importantly, before I launched the organization, I wanted to put a bioethics team together. I called a former friend, colleague, Arthur Kaplan, who's professor of bioethics at NYU, said, will you chair my global bioethics team? And put an advisory group together on bioethics. Very important for us to think about. Inclusivity, appropriate science, appropriate funding. What are we willing to fund? What are we not willing to fund? I'm a strong believer of this. Scientists should not be deciding what is ethically appropriate science within society. We need the expert advice of bioethicists who aren't directly conflicted in conducting the science to guide us, to say this is acceptable, this is not acceptable. If we don't do that, we cannot bring society along with us. And if we speak only as scientists to ourselves, then society will be left behind, after which our license to operate will be taken away by society. If you question that, take a look at so many fields in science that did not progress because society could not come along with us. Take a look at the food industry. Take your pick. It's very important we do that. And so we built a bioethics advisory group of some of the global leaders across the world, because ethics is very culturally relevant too. And we need to get a global perspective. Let me add on our last piece in all of this is our role to lead, convene, mentor. But if we end up being the smallest player in the field in 10 years, I will celebrate. Our mission is not to be always the biggest. It's all not to lead right at the front. It's not about competing with anybody. 100% today, and the majority in the future, of what we do is we do through partnerships. When I started building this team, I said, I don't want to build anything that already exists. A lab exists, partner with it. A research process exists, partner with it. That was the basis for AFAR, our announcement to fund AFAR. Why do I need to build a review process for grants when AFAR already has one? Impetus grants, they do fast turnaround grants. Why do I need to do that? Hire the key senior talent, build the oversight, partner as much as possible as you can around the world. What makes us different to any government funding agency is we can fund collaboration across boundaries, across geographies, across institutions, not within country. And every country says they do global funding. I can tell you the vast, vast majority of their funding is within the country where the taxpayers pay to support that institution. There's a reason it's the US National Institutes of Health. Vast majority is within the country. It's true in the UK, it's true in Ireland, it's true in the European Union. The problem there is very difficult to then collaborate across the world. And by the way, great ideas are not the monopoly of any one country or any one demographic. They're global. Developing countries have some brilliant scientists. It is a case of the opportunity. And let me finish. We want to grow the pie. We want to do it ethically. We want to take this field forward. At a personal level, leadership is about leading from behind. Leadership is about getting your organization and organizations to an endpoint and a mission, which is mission focus, not about the individual. Once we transition into this field of attracting not only more stars, which we need, but also attracting more leaders, this field will have matured to another level and has a chance of scaling in a sustained, durable way. My last comment is a personal experience. I gave a commencement speech a few years ago, and somebody asked me afterwards the key to my career, whatever success I'd had. And my answer truly is very simple. Maintain a curious nomadic life, nomadic in the mind, remain curious. And the second, my own experience is I've never yet, ever come up with a good idea. Everything I've ever done is to recognize somebody else's good idea. All I did was support it. And that's the only job a leader has. Create the vision and support the ideas of the people that choose to follow you. You don't choose to be a leader. It is the people who follow you that choose you as their leader. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khan. Extremely inspiring and great talk from a true leader. All right, we are going to... One question, at least.
Thank you. I'm going to be really naughty and ask you 2 questions, but I'll ask them together. The first is, and you alluded to it, but we know the pharma industry has been profitable and advanced only on doing research on Caucasians. In fact, the statistics are 86% of drugs are for male and white people. So what is your foundation doing to help or think about this issue and making sure that longevity medicine doesn't lag behind where all of the other parts of medicine has? And the second is your bioethics committee thinking about how to disrupt the obvious issue around the insurance industries, around the fact that this whole thing relies on risk prediction and supporting people and earlier diagnosis, and that in itself disrupts how payment works across the world?
So let me touch on this. These are 2 major topics. I'm actually writing a textbook chapter right now on funding mechanisms and how to develop new scientific disciplines. So it should be out, I think, later this year. The bottom line, 2 things. One is, I think we like to look at the insurance industry and it's easy to point fingers at any one sector. It isn't a sector. A sector behaves within the constraints of how it's allowed to operate, whether it's through investors or regulators or whatever. I'm old enough to remember when in the US, testing your blood sugar if you had diabetes was not a required insurance reimbursement. They didn't have to provide you. That changed. As the evidence came, that became the norm. Insulin is going through that now, all sorts of things. And being an endocrinologist, those are the examples I can give you off the top of my head. That will change. The question is, do we have the translational evidence to bring about that change? And that's what I touched on. So I think we need to start with ourselves and say, what is the evidence that we're going to need to move that, as opposed to say, why is it you guys can't do? They will do what the evidence suggests. The second, and we can get into all sorts of aspects of it. The second on inclusivity, absolutely. Remember our vision statement, which helped write, says, for the benefit of all, regardless of religion, demographics, whatever. So the question really is, how do we do that? There's 2 things to think about. One is, of course, you include them in trials. And as a right off the example, I'm going to be announcing very soon the first of a series of research grant programs which are directly targeted to developing countries. You know, if we keep saying to these countries, if you don't have the track record, you can't compete. Well, of course, if you're sitting in some smaller developing country, you'll never have the basic data to compete. But you may have a great idea. So we're targeting that. And the first won't be announced, will be several coming, which are going to be global as well as specific by geography and type. The second part of that is something that I want you to think about. The ability to do science is in part limited by physical and capital infrastructure of what already exists. If you have the labs, you have the analytic capability, now you can run another assay through it, right? Let's challenge that. What if physical infrastructure of labs now becomes a commodity? Now, given where global communications is going, where the metaverse is going, where virtual technologies are going, where robotics technologies are going, not too far distant, you could have a lab sitting in one country. Investigators around the world are leveraging that one lab, run with one technician, doing every sophisticated assay you can think about. All of a sudden, the study doesn't have to be conducted in a developed country, but you could have one of those robotic labs managed by an investigator giving as a consortium, conducting sample analysis in a population where otherwise this couldn't be done. I'm just giving you an example. That world is possible today. The question is, what's the barrier? Let me give you a couple of points. Number one, the way we fund research requires our overheads to be paid, which is the way universities support their current physical infrastructure, which in part is a monopoly. That's about to change, which is scary if you're the president of the university. If you're the dean of the school and says, but I don't need your lab, I just need your professor's mind. I can conduct this assay in the country where the sample has been obtained. By the way, the regulatory opportunity is huge because now sample doesn't have to cross borders. Do you understand? I can give you a whole lecture on the disruption of R&D in a way that we've never thought about. So my answer to you is, if you think in old school ways, nothing's going to change. If you really embrace what is already possible, let alone what might be possible in the next 5 years, the ability and the way we conduct R&D is about to go through its own revolution, just like communication and e-commerce and shopping and travel agencies and all the rest of it revolutionized. It is about to come to R&D. So if you're a professor wanting to live in the past, you're about to wake up. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Thank you.